Hello, this Science and Sport video is for BTEC Sport and Exercise Sciences, Unit 2 Functional Anatomy. We're looking at the cardiovascular system, Learning Aim B, and specifically we're looking at the B3, which is the cardiac cycle. This is part 2, the second video on the cardiac cycle, and in this video we're looking at neural control of heart rate or neural control of the cardiac cycle. So very quickly, just to recap what the cardiac cycle is. The cardiac cycle is the relaxation phase, which we call diastole, and the contraction phase, which we call systole, of the heart. So the heart relaxes and fills with blood, and then the heart contracts and ejects blood. And the contraction part of this actually has two phases. The atria contract and push blood down to the ventricles, and then the ventricles contract and push blood up and out of the aorta and the pulmonary artery. So the cardiac cycle involves a relaxation phase and a contraction phase. Now, I hope already that you would understand that if muscles so the heart obviously is, the chamber walls are made up of the myocardium, a muscular wall of the heart. If the heart chambers are relaxed, or the heart is in a relaxed state, you should appreciate already that if there's no contraction, there's no neural stimulus happening. If there is a contraction, so for example, if these atria chambers are being instructed to contract, that comes via a neural instruction. And if the ventricles over here then contract, then that muscle has been instructed or stimulated to contract by a neural impulse. And what this video is going to look at is how do we get the heart chambers, the atria to contract first, and then the ventricles to contract to do the jobs that they need to do. And also we're going to briefly look at not just how the chambers contract, but what influences us increasing or decreasing our heart rate. How do we control the heart rate itself? This is how we control the chambers contracting to make our heart beat once, but how do we influence our heart rate to make it change dependent on what we're doing? So the specification for this specifically looks at the neural control of the cardiac cycle. How do nerves control the relaxation and contraction phases of a heartbeat? And these four terms are terms that you're obviously going to have to learn. The sinoatrial node, if I replace this with pacemaker, the heart's pacemaker, it's the same thing. The atrioventricular node, the bundle of hairs, and the Purkinje fibers. So abbreviated sinoatrial node, SAN, and atrioventricular node, AVN. So let's look at the heart's anatomy again. You should know and be able to recognize we've got these top two chambers, the left atrium and the right atrium. We've got a dividing wall between the left and right sides of the heart, the septum. We've got the bigger two chambers, the ventricles, the right ventricle and the left ventricle. We've got valves between the atria and the ventricles, the atrioventricular valves. And we've got valves, and you can only see one really, in the vessels leaving the heart, leaving the ventricles and going into the aorta and the pulmonary artery. So we've got four valves, four chambers, and we've got the septum dividing the middle. Now what these diagrams show you are the electrical control system, or the cardiac control system of the heart. So let me just start here. So this number one label here is the sinoatrial node, the SAN. This is the pacemaker. Then we've got arrows spreading through the atria, and I'll come back to that. Then we've got this second blob, if you like. This is the AV node, the atrioventricular node. So we've got an SA node and then an AV node. And the AV node almost makes sense because it's more or less between the atria and the ventricles. A bit like these valves are atrioventricular valves. This is the AV node. And a node is a clump of very specialized cardiac cells. So SA node, AV node. Then we've got this single route going down the middle, going down the septum. Okay, this is called the bundle of His, H-I-S, the bundle of His. And it eventually divides to go into the left side of the heart and to go into the right side of the heart. Those are known as bundle branches. I don't think your specification has actually specified the bundle branches, but it goes to the left and to the right, so the left and the right, they're called bundle branches. And then we've got these straggly bits coming upwards, going upwards, and spreading all through the ventricles. And it's shown over here, look, the branches spreading up the ventricles and spreading up the ventricles. And they're the Purkinje fibers. So the four things your spec acknowledges you need to know are the sinoatrial node, the AV node, the bundle of His, the Purkinje fibers. So that's the sinoatrial node, the atrioventricular node, the bundle of His, and the Purkinje fibers. So I'd like to just show you a short video that animates the process of the conduction system, the neural control of the cardiac cycle, enabling the chambers to contract. Okay, so this puts it all together and shows you, to some degree better than I can verbally explain it.
Conduction system consists of the following components. The sinoatrial node, or SA node, located in the right atrium near the entrance of the superior vena cava. This is the natural pacemaker of the heart. It initiates all heartbeat and determines heart rate. Electrical impulses from the SA node spread throughout both atria and stimulate them to contract. The atrioventricular node, or AV node, located on the other side of the right atrium near the AV valve. The AV node serves as electrical gateway to the ventricles. It delays the passage of electrical impulses to the ventricles. This delay is to ensure that the atria have ejected all the blood into the ventricles before the ventricles contract. The AV node receives signals from the SA node and passes them onto the atrioventricular bundle, AV bundle or bundle of His. This bundle is then divided into right and left bundle branches, which conduct the impulses toward the apex of the heart. The signals are then passed onto Purkinje fibers, turning upward and spreading throughout the ventricular myocardium. Electrical activities of the heart can be recorded in the form of electrocardiogram, ECG, or EKG. An ECG is a composite recording of all the action potentials produced by the nodes and the cells of the myocardium. Each wave or segment of the ECG corresponds to a certain event of the cardiac electrical cycle. When the atria are full of blood, the SA node fires, electrical signals spread throughout the atria and cause them to depolarize. This is represented by the P wave on the ECG. Atrial contraction, or atrial systole, starts about 100 milliseconds after the P wave begins. The PQ segment represents the time the signals travel from the SA node to the AV node. The QRS complex marks the firing of the AV node and represents ventricular depolarization. Q wave corresponds to depolarization of the interventricular septum. R wave is produced by depolarization of the main mass of the ventricles. S wave represents the last phase of ventricular depolarization at the base of the heart. Atrial repolarization also occurs during this time, but the signal is obscured by the large QRS complex. The ST segment reflects the plateau in the myocardial action potential. This is when the ventricles contract and pump blood. The T wave represents ventricular repolarization immediately before ventricular relaxation or ventricular diastole. The cycle repeats itself with every heartbeat.
Okay, so basically that talked through and combined two bits of information. We know the cardiac cycle is the filling of the atria contracting and pushing the rest and the remaining bits of blood down to the ventricles, and the ventricles contracting and ejecting blood up and out of the heart. And we saw in that video that it's the SA node that initiates the contraction phase, the systole phase. The SA node, let's look at this one over here, look. The SA node sends out a wave of contraction through the atria, squeezing the blood from the top to the bottom of the atria down into the ventricles. The impulse then, in the meantime, makes its way to the AV node. So from here, makes its way to the AV node, where there's a slight delay. Then the impulse makes its way down the septum via the bundle of his, the bundle branches, and goes to the bottom of the heart. And at this point, it's not making the chambers contract, it's just basically getting to the bottom of the heart, because then, importantly, the wave of contraction goes from the bottom of the ventricles up the Purkinje fibers. So the atria contract top to bottom to push blood down into the ventricles, and the ventricles contract bottom to top to push the blood up and out. And that sort of makes sense. So atria contract pushing downwards, the impulse goes all the way to the bottom first and then spreads into the ventricles, making them contract bottom to top and pushing blood outward. So that's the systolic phase. When the heart is relaxed during diastole and is filling, there are no electrical impulses spreading through the heart. So the SA node is quiet during the filling phase and then sends out impulses during the systole phase, the contraction phase. And then there's a delay during diastole where everything relaxes and the blood fills again, the heart fills again, and then systole, another set of impulses is sent out. So the SA node sends intermittent impulses out, and in between the heart is relaxing. So you can pause the video yourself and have a little look at this cycle, and this tries to show both the connection between the relaxation and the contraction phases connecting with the SA node. So this is diastole. The purple shading in these diagrams shows where the contraction is. So diastole is zero contraction or relaxation and the chambers fill. Then the impulse starts from the SA node and spreads top to bottom of the atria, and the atria contract in systole to push blood down to the ventricles. At this point then, the impulse has gone from the SA node to the AV node. The impulse then goes from the AV node down the bundle of hairs, down the bundle branches to the bottom of the ventricles before spreading up the Purkinje fibers and up the chambers. Notice again, during that phase when the impulse travels from the AV node down to the bottom of the ventricles, there is no contraction in the heart. And the final phase, of course, is the second part of systole, where the ventricles contract and the impulse spreads up the Purkinje fibers to contract the ventricles bottom to top. So you've got to be able to connect what you understand already about the cardiac cycle, the filling, the contraction of the atria, the contraction of the ventricles in systole, and what you understand about the conduction system of the heart, the parts to it, the SA node, the AV node, the bundle of hairs, the Purkinje fibers, and how those two are connected, how this conduction system controls the contraction, the systole phases of the heart. So you can pause the video and have a look at this description of it. So this is more the anatomy, what these things are, what is the sinoatrial node, what is the AV node, what is the bundle of hairs, bundle branches, Purkinje fibers. That's more to do with the anatomy of the conduction system. Have a little read through that. But this is also quite an important one too. This, again, pause the video, this is integrating the conduction system activity and what happens in the cardiac cycle. So while the heart is in diastole, i.e. relaxed and filling, there is no conduction system activity, no neural activity. And of course, when the atria contract, stuff happens, and when the ventricles contract, stuff happens. This makes this happen. This makes this happen. So pause the video and have a little look. I just want to show you this exam question for 8 marks. This is a great thing to look at in terms of the mark scheme when preparing your revision materials for this topic. So this is an analyse question. It wants a lot from you. And if we interpret this question, it asks you to analyze, tell them how it works. The neural control of the heart regulates the cardiac cycle. So it's asking you, how do the neural factors, the conduction system stuff, regulate, control the cardiac cycle? So it wants information both about the cardiac cycle and the neural control. It wants the integrated version of it. So it wants information like this. How does this control this? And if I show you the mark scheme, it's worth you taking time to look at this and digest this and incorporate this in your revision materials. So here we've got the neural content. The sinoatrial node initiates an impulse, travels down the atria, causes them to contract, blah, 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 goes down to the AV node, into the bundle of hairs down the septum, goes down to and up the Purkinje fibers, causing the ventricles to contract. That's the neural component. But it also wants you to to analyze how the neural component regulates the cardiac cycle. So you need to incorporate your understanding of the cardiac cycle. Well, we know the cardiac cycle is relaxation, which is relaxation when the heart chambers and the ventricles relaxed and fill with blood, but has these systole phases, the contraction of the atria, which is this bit up here, and the contraction of the ventricles, which is this bit down here. So it wants you to integrate the two systems and explain how those connect. So January 2018, there was another question, only a 5-marker, describe, so it's a different verb, less information is required, describe the neural control of the cardiac cycle. So it kind of wants both, but not quite in as much detail. And it really just integrates them a bit more concisely. Its SA node initiates the contraction, the impulse that spreads through the atria, causing them to contract. The impulse then from the AV node goes down to the bundle of hairs and down to the ventricle walls and makes them contract, full stop. It doesn't give that extra detail about the cardiac cycle, the relaxation phase and the contraction phase. So what we've covered so far is what are the neural, or how do we control the phases of the cardiac cycle in the heart, the relaxation and the contraction bit. And we've talked about the SA node, the in-heart neural control, the SA node, the AV node, bundle of hairs, Purkinje fibers. But what you've also got to be aware of and mindful of is, well, what influences how fast or slow our heart beats. We've talked about how we make our heart contract, but what makes our heart contract faster, or the cardiac cycle happen quicker or slower? And essentially it's the same process as it was for the respiratory system for your control of breathing. You constantly have feedback from various receptors in your body that go to the brain, and the brain then automatically for you sends out impulses down nerves to your heart. And that's exactly the same as we will have talked about already in the respiratory system. We had chemoreceptors giving feedback to the respiratory control center, and the respiratory control center sending out nervous impulses and instructions to the respiratory muscles to make you breathe faster or deeper. Okay, same principle. So given that you don't consciously adjust your heart rate, you should recognize already that it's autonomically controlled. It's the autonomic nervous system. In the same way that we had the respiratory control center in the medulla oblongata in the brain, we also have a cardiac control center in the medulla oblongata of the brain. So it lives in the same place. It's just called a cardiac control center because it's to do with the heart. You know already it's automatic. We don't consciously do this. It's an unconscious process. And this control center will adjust your heart rate based on feedback from your body and what we're asking your body to do, whether you're nervous, excited, whether you're exercising or at rest, the chemical state of your blood, the oxygen levels, the CO2 levels in particular. Baroreceptors monitor blood pressure and thermoreceptors monitor temperature. So those 3 types of receptors send information to the cardiac control center, the CCC. If let's say there's lots of carbon dioxide in your blood and you're heating up because you're exercising, that information will be sent to the cardiac control center. And basically the brain knows, therefore, that we need to increase heart rate to process and to send out more blood per minute to increase our cardiac output and our stroke volume and our heart rate. So the cardiac control center will send an impulse down a sympathetic nerve. Now this one actually makes sense, and it's down here, look. The one that speeds up, accelerates heart rate, is called the accelerator nerve. That's a really nice, easy one. And that's a sympathetic nerve. So your autonomic nervous system has two sides, the sympathetic side, which tends to speed things up, and the parasympathetic side, which tends to inhibit things or slow things. So the brain goes, right, we've got loads of CO2, got maybe some waste products, we need to get rid of it, let's circulate more blood. Okay, I'm going to send an impulse down the accelerator nerve to the SA node and give it an instruction to make it fire faster, to make that whole process of impulses spreading down and through the AV node, the bundle of hairs, faster, faster, faster. Okay, so accelerator nerve actually makes sense because you're accelerating heart rate. If we've finished doing our exercise and the levels of CO2 in our blood have decreased and the levels of oxygen have increased, this feedback goes to the brain, the cardiac control center, and the cardiac control center would then go, right, we don't need heart rate to be as fast or as frantic anymore. Okay, I'm going to send impulses down the vagus nerve, which will inhibit heart rate. It will slow heart rate. So the vagus nerve decreases heart rate, the accelerator nerve accelerates heart rate, speeds up heart rate. And the vagus nerve is a parasympathetic nerve. Okay, the sympathetic side speeds up, the parasympathetic side slows down. I think that's pretty much what we need to know. So in this video, we've covered primarily the conduction system of the heart, which is your neural control of the cardiac cycle. How do we make the atria contract and the ventricles contract? Through impulses spreading through the atria and then eventually spreading up the ventricles. That's the conduction system of the heart. That's the neural control of the cardiac cycle. Actually, I prefer that being the title. This is the nervous process that controls the relaxation and contraction of the heart. But we've also added to that how we can influence the SA node, how we can change our heart rate based on feedback from the receptors in our body, telling our cardiac control center, and then an impulse either making our heart rate speed up or an impulse inhibiting our heart rate.